Michael Krätke is going to Mexico tomorrow for a series of conferences, and they will start at 11 a.m. on the paper. Actually, they start at 12 sometimes, and in the afternoon at 5. So starting an afternoon session is at 2:30. Is, you know, we wanted to give you this experience between Canada and Mexico. Michael has been here for now the conference during the last 4 or 5 days, and I will introduce him in a couple of minutes, just one maybe. He has been professor at the University of Political Economy at the University of Amsterdam for many years, 20 years. Then he decided, I didn't understand why, to leave Amsterdam and to go to Lancaster in the foggy England, and even to work more, because then he became chair of the Department of Political Science. But Michael has written many, many books, mostly in German, but they have been translated into many languages. He has been editor of the writings of Luxemburg, Otto Bauer, and many other famous Marxists. And he is, among the other things, like Marx, a journalist, especially, you know, Michael writes on economic crisis, and especially after 2008, we started to do this daily instead of weekly. And last but not least, which is related with the topic of our discussion today, he is one of the members of the International Editorial Board of the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, the collected works, the new edition of the collected works of Marx and Engels. So Michael will tell you today why could Marx not complete Capital. We will give to Michael 40 to 45 minutes of time. After this, we will ask to the students, the young colleagues and scholars here, to ask you questions, clarification, couple of minutes per person, and then we will ask George Comnimal, who is the official discussant today, to say something about your presentation. And if you want, Michael, I will say 10 more minutes for you at the end in order to respond and to reorganize all the questions. So, okay. Once again, welcome to everybody.
Are senior scholars allowed to ask questions?
Of course. Oh, senior, yes. Maybe
all
after the young.
Are young. No, there's no
After the young.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here again on the campus of York University, and I'm in particular grateful that I have the opportunity to present something to you of the work on the Mega, which is actually not a collected works, it is a complete works. Everything, really everything that is important and that we regard as, well, really important to know will be published. Also small notebooks and excerpts and whatever you can think of. Our two authors have written a lot. Well, obviously, there is an obvious answer to the question I would like to discuss with you and, today, why Marx did never finish Capital, because he died at the age of 65. But I think the story is a little bit more complicated. And the story is also complicated in the sense that I have to rely upon a lot of material that has only very recently been published and not yet in English, and even more material that has not yet been published. So I have to ask you to trust me that it really exists on paper, and I'm not making up anything. If I would, all my colleagues would kill me the very next day, so it is recorded, and I will be very careful not to tell you fancy stories. Okay, Marcelo did encourage me, sorry, why doesn't it work? It does. To go a little bit back, and I will concentrate on the very 15 last years of Marx's life and the enormous amount of studies he did in this period, But I start a little bit early and just remind you, the whole project of the critique of political economy started actually in 1844. And what is puzzling for us is that until this very day, there is not one capital, if I use capital as a shorthand for the critique of political economy, but there are several. And now just to give you an overview, there are 8 different drafts, and I don't have the time to go into detail about the changes and the difference between each of them, but I will tell you a little bit more, in particular about what happened in the end of this long period, this long road towards capital, which always remained an unfinished project. Well, it starts, with, as you all know, with the Grundrisse manuscript, continues with, a year later with the contribution to the critique of political economy, which is only a very small part of the very first part. Then it continues with a huge manuscript in 1861-63. It doesn't have a title in Marx. You all know it, or a part of it, under the title Theories of Surplus Value, but it's only a very small part of it. And then follow the economic manuscripts of 64-65. I will tell you in more detail what this is. And then eventually comes Capital Volume 1 in 1867. And immediately afterwards, and that is where I'm immediately starting to take issue with many of the current interpretations or views about what Marx did after 1867. He did not give up, certainly not. He continued the work on Capital nearly the very same day that Capital Volume 1 was published. So there is a series of economic manuscripts, and I will tell you in much detail what they are, from the winter 67-68 onwards until the summer of 1881, and you have related works that also continues until 1882, so more or less immediately before his death. In the 70s, there is a second, and you can say even the third version of Capital Volume 1, the second German edition and the first French edition, which mark important changes. And there is at the very end of Marx's life, I will quote this several times just to put it into your heads, there are preparations for a third German and a first English edition. And Marx has left a lot of notes, preparatory for that. What to do with the text, how to change, what the final version should look like. And he said it and wrote it in letters twice, once in 1871 and once in December 1881. It's there, it's already published, you can read it. I will have to rewrite the whole thing. The German term means, well, rework, you would say. It's rewriting, reworking, complete change. That is what he intended to do at the end. So I start very briefly with the Grundrisse, and this year, 1857, is remarkable because it's also the year of the very first world economic crisis. And Marx was a witness of that, and he wrote as a journalist about it, a lot. And he also started, because he's an empirical researcher, he's not a philosopher. At that time, certainly not anymore. He's an empirical researcher. He starts a project. It's called, not yet published, The Books of Crisis. It's a preparatory work for a study of about the events, what really happened during this first world economic crisis. And the Grundrisse, which he wrote exactly at the same time, is the first draft for the planned critique of political economy. Before that, and it's very brief, the main point is this one. Here, look at this. He started in the early 1850s with a new effort, huge effort, to study political economy, and this time not only the big theories, but also empirical facts, statistics and facts. And the outcome is something like this, 1854-57, not yet published, but it is a manuscript with the remarkable title, Money, Credit and Crisis, and that's a topic that keeps him busy throughout the time until the end of his life. So there are a lot of reflections and a lot of studies already before he starts writing the Grundrisse. It's not just the big theories, there's also a lot of empirical material going into it. The Grundrisse is, in my perception, I'm very brief about it, and have a big issue with my beloved friends, Marxist philosophers. I think they are completely wrong. The Grundrisse is not the pinnacle of Marx thinking, just the beginning. It's a research manuscript. It's not a philosophical treatise, although a lot of thoughts are in there. It has a very rough structure. There are only 2 completely unstructured chapters. And it is a text where, and that is why it is fascinating, where the author is constantly criticizing himself. Well, Marx doesn't use very harsh language, but even in this text, sometimes he tells himself, this is complete nonsense. I will have to rewrite this. I will have to change the manner of presentation. This is wrong. It cannot go on. It doesn't fit in here. I have to do it otherwise. This is a complete one commentary upon himself after the other. He's always trying to correct himself. Actually, he's experimenting with his famous dialectical form of presentation or exposition. He doesn't have it clear-cut in his head already. He's working on it and trying, how does it work? Does it work or doesn't it? And very often it does not. And then he stops it and starts again. He does, in this manuscript, discover a lot of new concepts, but there are also a lot of core concepts you're all familiar with that are still missing. He has not yet, well, developed them in his head. For instance, a very basic, you all think it's a basic distinction between variable and constant capital. It's not yet there. You will not find it in this manuscript. He also has, and you all know this, there is a plan, the famous huge plan of 6 books. The last book is a book on world market and the crisis. There's even a book on the state in the original plan. And Marx is changing this plan, not once, but several times. And he already starts in the Grundrisse several times to change this plan. So it is a myth that he had originally a plan, dropped it completely, and then started something completely new. It's not true. He kept changing this plan for several years. But the Grundrisse is also full of digressions, for instance, all about the pre-capitalist forms of productions. It's full of anticipations, full of things that he just gets in his head and puts aside. There are very long passages that are just collections of material and nothing else. And what you also see is that Marx experimenting is running into a lot of problems he cannot yet solve, and so he keeps it in mind and continues to work on them. And I will just mention one, which is again against the prevailing philosophical interpretation. Of course, Marx uses, and is very well familiar, the concept of totality. It's part of his heritage, nothing new. For him, it's quite familiar. But he deals with it and tries to explain how does capitalism develop as a self-reproducing system. And immediately he runs into trouble, because a basic element of his own concept of modern capitalism, the value theoretical approach is based upon it, the idea that living labor is the basic creative source. That is where everything wealth, societal wealth comes from, is an element that doesn't fit into it. You cannot produce it capitalistically. This is not a commodity that can be easily produced inside the capitalist system. Or the capitalist system is not a closed system, it's not 100% self-reproducing. On the contrary, it is open, and necessarily so. And you have a lot of problems or difficulties to deal with that openness. Well, the next step is the publication of the very first part of the very first book of Capital. It's only the very first chapters, as you all know. And in the run-up towards that, Marx, if you like, sums up, the very first version for that, sums up his auto-criticism of the Grundrisse. And the auto-criticism simply says, well, you can use the dialectical method of exposition, but only if you're very careful and if you're aware of its limits. That's how he sums up. Well, every single question you have to ask, what are exactly the limits? But that is his level of consciousness, self-consciousness at that moment. And he reproduces in this text still the research agenda of the classical political economist, because he announces very proudly at the end of the first chapter, well, you will see in the future development, this is only the beginning, how I deal with our theoretical heritage. And these are problems that cannot be solved within the framework of classical political economy. For instance, how can labor be a commodity and have exchange value? How can the value-creating power also have value? It seems to be an absurdity. How can the value of labor be smaller than the value of its product? Basic problem for the Ricardian socialists. How can market prices of commodities be completely different from their values, as the classical economists already were aware of? They probably are. So how do you explain that? And how can natural resources or other use values that are not produced by human labor be commodities and also have a value and a price? It's a classical so-called value paradoxon that every classical economist was aware of. So Marx is still inside the research agenda of the classical political economy and announces solutions. I will tell you how this is possible in the further parts of the book. Well, in 1861 he took a new start, completely new start, based upon these programmatic announcements in the contribution. Now he has his own unsettled questions, which are referring to money, to value, to price, to the reproduction of capital, to everything that he has tried before in the Grundrisse. He has tried to deal with accumulation, technological change, and so-called progress. He's tried for the first time to theorize competition, because he says, well, no one has ever yet done this. They have only talked about it and moralized in one or the other way, but no one has ever analyzed what competition really means. He tries to come to grips with what he himself calls price and value revolutions, very much influenced by Thomas Tuck. There are periods of heavy upheavals. Everything is changing. The whole market world is in turmoil. He called this value revolutions, price revolution. How do you explain that? It should be more than just a word. And then, of course, he's fascinated and tries to explain crisis, periods of crisis, and their outcomes. And their outcomes are, and that's not the wisdom of the 20th century, Marx already knew it, transformations of the capitalist mode of production. Big crises change capitalism. That is simply, and well, if we look around us, that is also what we can say. It will be the outcome. In the years to come, we see a big transformation of capitalism as we knew it. It's already going on. And then he tries to bring together theory and history of modern capitalism. He's a very historical-minded guy. How to explain the phenomena, and that is his core problem, of the modern business cycle and of the historical changes of the modern business cycle. They have not always existed. There is nearly 400 years of capitalist development without a business cycle, and curiously enough, early in the 19th century, everything changes. And from 1815 onwards, you have this regular secular movement. So it is part and parcel, essential for modern capitalism, but it has not always been there. Already capitalism has been with us for quite a while. So the manuscript of 1861 to 3 is huge. It's a mixture. It's partly rereading the classics, re-encounter with Marx has read 5 times Ricardo in different Ricardo's main work in different editions. He has read several times, 5, 6 times Adam Smith. So the core authors come back again and again. It's partly rereading the classics, and it's partly rewriting writing the second version of the critique of political economy. And what does he do with the Grundrisse? He didn't have a very high esteem of the Grundrisse. He thought this is all chaos. He uses a German expression, Kraut und Rüben, which means everything is thrown together. It's not order, it's not structure. He uses it as material. So there are passages from the Grundrisse he simply takes over in his new manuscript. That's normally how he works and how he deals with his own text. The manuscript of 1861 and 63 is of crucial importance because you see a lot of advances and new discoveries, and the bulk of it is not the theories of surplus value, but the bulk of it is what you could see as a first draft of core chapters of Capital Volume 1 and of Capital Volume 3. And he uses all his notebooks and he uses his previous manuscripts. There are some discoveries, I very briefly mentioned some of them, like the methods of absolute and relative surplus production. So there's a highly differentiated treatise of what does it mean to use these famous methods. What methods do exist and how does it change the whole world of production? Well, it creates a factory system, something that was still very, very new at that time. And so he comes up with the first analysis in detail of the factory system, and something that you might not be aware of because you only remember this from Capital Volume 1, but in this manuscript Marx gives an extensive, long-winded explanation why factory legislation that actually started in 1804 in England, and at that time already there was a general outcry, this will be the end of the world, this will be labor legislation, this will be the end of the world, we will be outcompeted, this will be the ruin of British industry. And the more they did in the 1830s, 1840s, the louder was this resistance. And Marx said, well, it's nonsense. Statistics show that they flourished. And now he gives a value theoretical explanation why factory legislation is not to the detriment of the industrialists and of the factory system, but on the contrary, well, supports it, makes it easier, makes it even more competitive than it was ever before. It's not very well known, but it is worth your while to think about it. He dealt with legislation and the impact of legislation upon the capitalist economy. Then we have Marx's rediscovery of the tableau économique, the famous French physiocrat, first efforts to modelize the whole of the capitalist economy, and he develops for the first time his reproduction schemes. And these reproduction schemes in this manuscript are in graphics, not the numerical or algebraic examples that you know. These are real little drawings by Marx, where he tries to, in a very similar style to Krätke, to develop what is actually going on the macroeconomic level when the different parts of the capitalist economy are in exchange with each other, including the monetary flows. So it's a highly sophisticated exercise already. It's not yet finished. And he starts to work with the general rate of profit, with the new concept of cost price and the price of production, and he invents something for the first time which is very, very tricky for the labor theory of value. This is market value. And market value means there is a distinction between individual value and, if you like, social value. Marx even uses the term false social value, because on the market the values can be turned around and inverted. He plays with his thoughts and he invents the categories to deal with it. And then he starts a distribution, theorizing the distribution of surplus value, which includes the rent, ground rent, interest, commercial profit for the first time. And he even ends with the very first sketch of what you today find at the end of Capital Volume 3, the sketch of the Trinitary formula, capitalism as a religion of everyday life, all the economic fictions and the fetishistic forms brought together and presented in an ensemble as a whole. Well, in 1867, to get to my last 15 years of his life, when it all gets more and more difficult, you know that he published Capital Volume 1, but actually that was the second version of Volume 1, because in the 2 years before, 1864-65, he actually wrote the very first complete or nearly complete version of Volume 2, Volume 3, and Volume 1. Of these very first versions have, in the meantime, in the original language, already been published. So they are accessible. Of the very first version of Capital Volume 1, written in that very same time. Only one chapter has survived, the famous Resultate, the results of the immediate production process. This is the last chapter of this first version. And the structure is still very, very different from what it was to become. Well, in 1867, when Capital Volume 1 was out, what had he achieved? He did this. He published Volume 1 as a separate volume against his original plan, because he was very sure, well, I'm so far advanced, within a few months I will be able to continue and to publish also Book 2 and 3. So that is why he immediately, even still while he was waiting for the proofs and traveling in Germany, he was working on his manuscripts. And thought, well, come back in London, immediately started the work on the 2 drafts he already had. So he had one first draft of the whole text of Volume 3 in 3 large chapters. It's relatively voluminous and completely different from what you know as Capital Volume 2. And he has a very first draft of the whole text of Volume 3 in 7 very large and very unstructured chapters. That is something that also looks different from the version that you know that has been edited by Engels. And then he has a detailed plan from 1863, it's in the previous manuscript, how to build Volume 3, what to do in Volume 3, and he wanted at that stage end the whole presentation with an analysis of capitalist circulation. So coming back to the starting point of Volume 1, which is simple circulation, the surface of what is going on in the markets, and ending the whole exercise with a very similar presentation, but now the full complexity. What does it mean? Market relation, prices, exchanges, in a fully developed capitalist economy. That is the original plan that you find in several versions in these years. So in the end we would have 3 different steps, 3 different analyses of the whole of the circulation process, which makes it immediately clear that capital is certainly not only about production. Production is not the only important thing. It is the interplay between the both, between what he called circulation and production. Then he knows, of course, that he has a lot of analytical problems, and he sees it immediately, unsolved. There is a circulation and the turnover of capital, and in particular their impact, their effect upon value production. And that is why Marx develops concepts like an annual rate of surplus value. And this annual rate of surplus value is that relation that shows you, or that is at least the intention, how the turnover of capital is influencing surplus value production. He is not yet done with the analysis of reproduction and accumulation. He is not yet done with the profit rate. And what he's very, very familiar with throughout his many studies, and you will see immediately how important that is for him, is the theory of money and credit and modern finance. Because that is, in particular, credit money and the dynamics of production and realization of value. In between, in 1866, there is one core event, also forgotten by most people. There was a big crisis in 1866. This was, for the 19th century, what the crisis of 1907 was for the early 20th century, the biggest financial crisis ever. And Marx immediately jumped upon it and analyzed it, and again wrote a book on crisis, brought together a lot of material in order to explain in much detail how is it possible that this crisis is, or looks, first and foremost like a financial crisis, and how is it affecting the real economy. He develops a lot of concepts for that, and you see him, he is not done with a crisis, on the contrary, and from that time onwards he thinks in a triple a combination of three elements of the dynamics of capitalism. It's always real accumulation, monetary accumulation, what he calls fictitious accumulation, the accumulation of fictitious wealth in the financial markets. Now what he does in the winter of 1868, 1867, 68, and the whole following year, there was another big effort following the example of the 1850s. It's very similar. There's another series, a pile of notebooks that he writes, completely focusing upon financial markets, money and credit, and always international money and credit as well. And there is a second one, so you have two piles of notebooks exactly about the same topic, the next series of very detailed empirical studies on financial markets, money and credit. In particular about London, what is happening in the city of London, but also already in 1868 about Wall Street. What's going on in New York? New York was a very young, rising star among the financial markets at that time, and was already bold to see it as important in the future. But he sees it, and he studies in particular international money and finance and the worldwide payment chains and the worldwide credit chains. Sorry, I left out something. Impossible. And he continues with studies on the history of banking and the technique of banking. So this is a very empirical-minded guy. He wants to know in detail how this works. And so he even starts to study accountancy in order to understand how these people calculate their rates of profit. He is fascinated from 1873 onwards with another big event in the 19th century, that is the First Great Depression. It started actually in 1873, and it started in a remarkable way with a very, very long crisis. It lasted from 1873 to 1879. And Marx was completely puzzled, because he was convinced there are no permanent crises. Crises are just moments for some months or maybe a year, and then it's over, it's turning around. It didn't. It lasted for years and years. So in the 1870s, he's continuously studying the events of these very big, very long-lasting crises. And he wants to know, well, what is going on, what are the consequences of this great crisis, the major transformation. And so you see the whole range and scope and the widening scope of his studies, because he follows now in different parts of the world the rise of the great corporations, the rise of the gold standard. It was not yet established. It was established during the years of the First Great Depression. So it's a complete change of the monetary system of the world. And there is also a change in terms of the international division of labor between the major capitalist powers. Well, this is one part of his work, but at the very same time, the very same guy is writing Capital Volume 2, second version, second draft. This is the largest of all the in total there are 10. The first one is from 1864-65 for Volume 2. This is the second one. He also calls it second, and this is the largest. It's much larger than that what Engels has published eventually. So a lot of the stuff in this manuscript has been dropped by Engels. It's a complete rewriting of the first draft, and it does cover all the three chapters and all the three sections of it. And you have for the first time a very detailed analysis of the circulation and the turnover of capital, or simply how do factories, the factory system, and the modern markets interact, how capital flows interact inside the enterprise and beyond. It is the first effort, now in numerical algebraical form, of an analysis of the reproduction and circulation of total social capital. It is a multi-sectoral scheme, curiously enough. Marx was not a very good mathematician in practical terms, so it's sometimes very clumsy, but he works with 6, 7 different sectors and subsectors. And then he analyzes the flows, monetary flows between those. So it gets very, very clumsy and difficult to follow, but he was, well, heading in the right direction. It's trying to get this in detail into one complete model and presentation of what was really going on the macroeconomic level. And he develops all this, and he does all this because he is, of course, completely aware of the structure of his own theory. Many Marxist economists are not. But for him it was completely clear that Capital Volume 2 is providing the decisive intermediary links between the monetary theory that you find in the first volume and the monetary theory that he at least intended to develop, and it's very clear there, the intention, in Volume 3. So that is why at the same time he's studying empirically the world and the changing world of money and credit and banking, and trying to develop this intermediary link that you need in order to build further. Well, in 1872-75, he's rewriting Capital Volume 1 and making a lot of changes. There are major changes in the French edition, in particular in the last section, and this work clearly has an impact upon his continuing work on Volume 2 and Volume 3. The major changes are, well, the chapter on commodity fetishism is expanded. It's made very much clear because he knows now at the end I will present you the whole thing together, all the different fetishism. There's not only commodity fetishism, there are much more fetishisms to come. He works and reworks and expands the theory of accumulation, the theory of employment and unemployment. The French section is vital for that. If you want to understand Marx's theory of employment and unemployment, a lot of people who say there isn't any, or it's just about a reserve army. It's not true. It's there in the most detailed version. And Marx's intention was, and he said it very, very often, very clear, the French edition should be the base for every further edition of Capital Volume 1, because he himself regarded this as important progress that he had made. Well, there is a shifting emphasis, even in value theory, towards a very diachronic and dynamic conception of value production. Value is not just ready when the labor has been done. The process is going on. It's a social process that goes beyond the individual factory. That's also clear in the changing formulations that he uses, emphasizing in this new version of Capital Volume 1. Then he makes a lot of changes in the factory chapter, and for instance, he redefines and makes it much more complicated than ever before, a concept you're all familiar with, the famous concept of the organic composition of capital. Now it gets really tricky, because there are three concepts linked together: technical composition, value composition, and what he calls organic composition, which means that there is a specific relationship between these two. It's a very tricky concept, but he just puts it there in order to announce there will be something coming in the chapters of the volumes to come. And most people regard as, or many historians regard as the most important progress. It's quite clear from the French edition that he has reviewed his concept of what is a classical form of capitalism. There is no longer one, there are several. And he even plays with the thought, well, I will use the United States, maybe other countries, other parts of the world, as the base or the main example. Maybe not for everything, as a factory, the factory system was the most developed still in the United Kingdom or in England, in particular in England. But there were changes in other parts of the world where he thought, well, maybe the Americans are more advanced, and we'll tell you in a minute in what respect. And he stresses very clearly the decisive role of states and law and institutions. With that in mind, he continues to work on Capital Volume 2 and Volume 3, and there are, apart from the 9 manuscripts I already mentioned for Volume 2, there are 15 for Capital Volume 3, and the longest is more than 130 pages long. These are mostly analytical, highly mathematical, also clumsy, you could say. Marx wasn't a good mathematician, but he tried it. Efforts to analyze the factors or the elements that influence the change in the variations of the rate of profit in relationship with the rate of surplus value. At the same time, he continues to write notebooks, so the empirical and statistical and historical studies continue. There is another third, nearly complete draft for Capital Volume 2, written between 1877 and 1881. If you take all these little and longer manuscripts together, you could say, well, there is a third version. And he was also preparing for another draft of Capital Volume 3, in particular Section 1, where we are dealing with profit and cost price and the rate of profit. But I would go much further. If you look at his notebooks and his preparatory work, he was preparing also for another draft of Section 5, which is on money and interest-bearing capital and financial markets. And all his collections of material and all his little annotations and remarks point in this direction. And he was also preparing another version, and I will tell you more detail right away why I think that was the case, another version for Section 6, which is about the ground rent. And there is much more. And now come the awkward studies. You all know this, or probably, and most of you know that Marx did this. He learned Russian around 1870. He was able to read it. Well, the real linguistic genius was Engels, who was able to speak fluently 12 languages. Marx wasn't that good, but he was able to read Russian and a lot of other languages. He became fascinated by Russia. That was different from his previous studies in the 1850s, when he was first and foremost fascinated by Russia as a traditional imperialist power that played a big role, always together with the United Kingdom. So there are two villains, in Marx's perception, of the 18th and early 19th century, Britain and Russia, working together all the time. But this time it shifts. It shifts towards the economic relations in Russia. Since the early 1860s, there was agrarian reform, and the whole agrarian sector of Russia was one of the biggest agrarian exporters of the world at that time, and the very same, or due to these agrarian reforms, a new development was triggered, and the development was in the direction of industrialization. And that was state-led and state-driven. So you had a developmental state of the 19th century. That was Tsarist Russia. And that's the reason why Marx was fascinated. There is another big part of his studies at the very same time, the 1870s, sometimes more, sometimes less, but he continues. That is the study of the United States of America, American studies. He became fascinated with the United States. He already had a good knowledge of it, due to his journalistic work on the Civil War, when he for the first time tried to characterize the peculiarities of US capitalism. But now he sees very clear the USA are, in our parlance, he didn't use these words, but the US are, well, even the most remarkable example of an NIC or an NHC, a new industrializing country, a new agrarian country of the 19th century. And in particular, he studied in much detail the industrialization of agriculture in the Midwest. Mass-scale, monoculture, mechanized agricultural production for the world market, and nothing else. Linked together with the railway system, linked together with the exchange, the commodity exchange in Chicago, and the rising financial market in New York. The new a change in the world of, in the capitalist world markets. And he sees also the rise of the new food industry, which is, if you like, a pre-form of what we later called Fordism. Fordist techniques were used for the first time, already nobody talked about it in this way. And he sees the rise of a new working class. So in many respects, he is fascinated by the US, and he even regards it as the most developed capitalist country in the world. In particular, with respect to the type of modern working class. These are the workers of the future. These workers are completely mobile. These are industrial workers, no longer have any traits of an artisanate, They are completely rational figures operating in markets. And so these are the people he's thinking about when he thinks about the working class as a actor, a world historical actor that will change the world. And there are more comparative studies. And I just very briefly mentioned it because at the same time he also studies agricultural change in the British colonies, like Ireland. Ireland was the most important, the first, and for a long time the most important British colony in the middle of Europe. And then India, of course. He was fascinated by India and studied agricultural change there, recent technology changes, and you will see right away how far he went, and the railway development in particular in America and Europe, and the changes in the world market and the changes in international money and banking. Well, since 1877, he seriously thought about finishing capital, and so he started parallel to prepare a new and better version of Capital Volume 1, the third German, the first British English edition. And he was preparing and already working on further drafts for Capital Volume 2 and Volume 3. And now come the big problems. There's a theory of ground rent, and Marx sees, because of his studies of the United States of America, that his own theory, he was very proud of that, of the absolute rent. So his solution to the Ricardian riddle, Ricardian couldn't give a good explanation for that. He was able to do it, but now he sees, is intelligent enough, oh, this doesn't work. My theory of ground then has to be revised. I will tell you in a little bit more detail right away. At the same moment, he realizes, with respect to the theory of money, money is actually, and that is what he's driving at, completely, and even now on the international level, substituted by credit. Because the gold standard, as he realizes immediately, is not really gold standard. It is based upon not US Treasury bonds, but British Treasury bonds. That's the main difference. Today it's US Treasury bonds that is our international monetary system hinges upon. The 19th century in the gold standard were British Treasury bonds, and the British Central Bank bought them. So behind the pound sterling was the credit of the British state, the British Empire, and nothing else. Marx was very well aware of that, and he tried to develop his theory of value exactly in this direction. The third difficult problem for him was the theory of the profit rate. He had to explain what does determine all the possible variations of the rate of profit, because he became more and more uncomfortable about the explanation that he had already given in 1864-65, so a few years ago, in his first draft for Capital Volume 3 of the famous law of the falling rate of profit. He wasn't so pleased with it anymore, and he looked for another solution. So there were several big problems he still had to fight with. I go in a little bit of more detail about the theory of the absolute rent. It's just an example. He had developed this solution for the riddle of the absolute rent in terms of his own labor theory of value, or in 1862. The basic argument is there is a lasting difference in the organic composition of capital due to simply natural conditions between these two sectors, agriculture and industry, modern industry, that cannot disappear, and landowners just use this. Now he sees, well, industrialization of agriculture is possible, and at a very high pace, and so this will change a lot. In the end, this difference in terms of the organic composition of a capital between these two sectors will disappear. You might have even higher organic compositions of capital in the modern agro-industry. So what do? You have to change this explanation. It doesn't mean that it's completely invalid, but it's only valid for certain periods of time. So again, it's not a general law, it is a historical law. A law that is valid for certain phases of the development of modern capitalism, and you have to change it or add something to it. Actually, you have to have two laws, or two explanations for two different phases of capitalist development, in this case the development of capitalist agriculture. and that also means revisions of the theory of differential rent linked to changes in agricultural technology. Well, what he sees clearly, 5 minutes? Okay, I'm speeding up. As Marx clearly sees...
Michael, so that you can,
right.
you can discuss with
he sees that a lot has to be changed, among other things his original formulation for the falling rate of profit. You also see that many others of his previously stated laws have to be revised. And he's not afraid of this. So this is clear. He does not shirk away. He sees this very clearly and wants to work on it. Now, there is the very last phase, and that is where the biographers and the critics of Marx say, well, this is really the end. He is now very sick, very ill, broken man, but nonetheless, he's still going on. There is a series of studies of the sciences starting in the 1870s, 1876, continued until the very end. There are the famous ethnological, anthropological studies, there's even world historical studies. Again, he has done it before, but he does it now again. And he continues his work on Capital, Volume 2 and Volume 3. Well, my question, of course, is not so much from the point of view of an anthropologist, whether Marx was a good anthropologist or not. My question is, why did he do that? Because he still was under enormous pressure, and he wanted to finish Capital, and he saw a long list of unsolved problems in front of him. So why did he now switch to the economic history of pre-capitalist and even prehistoric societies? Again, not for the first time, but again. There are major findings. Very interesting for him to study the variety of forms of landed property and real estate in different periods of time, and to study in particular the variety of forms of exploitation of peasant and agrarian labor. I think it is mostly because of that. He sees that there is much more is possible in terms of the exploitation of labor than that he has so far analyzed. And in the larger sense, it is important because for him it brings back the role of the state, the role of law, the role of institutions. Actually, it ends with very clear, or several statements which are very clear. The modes of production are not so simple. There is a variety. As there is a variety of capitalism, there's also a variety of feudalisms. And you cannot simply say, well, India is a feudal country, or there is feudalism. Well, maybe it looks like it, but if you look closer, it's not like that. Well, that is what his main outcome is for him. And he does this, and you will be surprised by it. Because he has in mind, or his idea is to historize nearly everything. So you will run, when you read this carefully, these ethnological, anthropological studies, in his comments, he uses the categories of Capital, Volume 1, the very first chapters. Value form. The value form for Marx has an historical meaning. He analyzes markets in India, ages ago, in terms of the value form. So you could say Marx did never understand his own theory, as some philosophers think, but that is actually what he does. Okay, I jump ahead. He did mathematical studies. Everybody understands why he does it. I disagree with people who say Marx was a brilliant mathematician. He did many inventions, but he was very, very aware of the state of the art. And he did it because he had an important exchange with his friend Seymour, and he was asking Seymour, now I have all this material, I want to analyze the cyclical development of modern capitalism. Can we do this? Can we develop formulas for that? Well, you all know that this is possible, of course. Today we know how to do this. At that time, nothing like that existed. And Seymour said, no, I have no idea how to do this. So Marx gave it up, for, as he said, for the time being. Actually, he did not give it up. So he tried to study for himself. And he's focusing upon the calculus, differential calculus, because this is a way in which you analyze changes, dynamical change. And so it goes exactly in this direction, and you see him use what he has learned in his many smaller and longer manuscripts where he analyzes mathematically the relations between the changes of the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit. Then he starts studies of science, and there you would say he's going completely astray. It has nothing to do whatsoever with political economy. There is a series of notebooks on physiology, on mineralogy, on geology, and agrochemistry. He has already done this in the 1850s. And now huge, and much more than Engels, by the way. Everybody thinks Engels was a specialist, but Marx excerpts and notebooks on science are much larger than Engels. And of course he was in debate with Engels about their joint project, which you probably know under the title, the wrong title, the misleading title, of the Dialectics of Nature. And there is a second series of notebooks from 1877 to 1883 on chemistry, on physics, in particular on electricity, and on statistical thermodynamics. That, of course, has a lot to do with the rise of new industries, because the Great Depression was also the period in which the so-called second industrial revolution started, with completely new technologies and completely new industries. And that is what Marx was fascinated by. He wanted to understand what's going on. In the terms of the agriculture, he also wanted to understand how is it possible, because it means that you change the basis of political economy. The base is that there is a well-established, a pre-established pattern of inequalities of fertilities. Well, this can obviously be changed once you introduce agrochemistry on a very large scale. You can change a lot. So the whole base of the theory falls apart, if you like. And he has to understand what is going on. And he was, of course, fascinated by the advances in the sciences, and he regards this as in methodological terms, also very important, because the very concept of laws of nature was changing at that time. And Marx regards them more and more as laws of development. And he uses this term again and again, which has implication for his interpretation of the law of value. Then the last odd example, Marx studies of world history. It's huge. It's in 1880. He spends a lot of time. There are 4 big notebooks only on world history with a focus. Marx knows what he's doing, and the focus is on the rise of the modern state, not only in Europe. This also shows that it is nonsense to say Marx was an Eurocentrist. He might have been when he was very young, but at that time he certainly wasn't anymore. So the focus is not only on Europe, it's dealing with Persia, with China, with India, with Japan, with whatever he can lay his hands on, of course on the level of knowledge that was available at that time. And he is studying now the interplay between the elements of what we call a capitalist economy, from technology to credit, everything, with the rise of the modern political powers. Because there is a link. States do promote, do contribute to the development of modern capitalism, and he sees very clearly capitalism as a world system. Okay, in 1876 to 1881, he wrote his very last manuscript for Capital Volume 2. This is unfortunately unfinished, but it's the last effort by Marx to come to grips and come to an end with the analysis of the accumulation process in real and in monetary terms. And he has already introduced that in the second version of Capital Volume 1, in the chapter on accumulation. It's there. If you don't look carefully, you don't see it, but it's there. It's a small change. And well, there is simple accumulation and there is accelerated accumulation. Or we would today say intensive, extensive forms of accumulation. This is an announcement. He doesn't analyze it, but it will come in the later parts. Here he tries it. He tries for the first time to develop these into a workable concept. He doesn't succeed. He breaks off this is really where illness and sickness and so on play a role, but it goes clearly in this direction, and it also shows very clearly that he knows what he is doing with respect to the development of his theory of money. Well, the very last years show Marx as an empirical researcher and as a theoretical thinker who's building a theory, but he's no longer a philosopher. The very last document referring to a clearly philosophical study of Hegel's writings is from 1862. It's very brief. It's just about the so-called small logic. And the last philosophical studies that Marx did linked to his studies of science is reading Leibniz and Descartes, the very beginnings of the modern philosophy of nature. That's the last thing he did, nothing else. There is no Hegel anymore. He's not interested. So there is no further evidence except the cooperation with Engels on the anti-Düring and other things. So I'm nearly finished now. I will only remind you of the plans he had in 1881. This is partly interpretation, but the material is all there. So Marx was obviously looking for a complete and coherent version of his reproduction schemes. And he did not finish it, but he had in mind accelerated accumulation, which means accumulation with technological change, and he knew a lot about the technological change that was going on at his time. He was searching and approaching the concise formula of the profit rate. He was very much aware of the shortcomings of his first draft of the so-called law of the falling rate of profit. So in the final version of Capital, it would certainly have looked different. He was aware of the shortcomings and enormous gaps in his first draft of Section 5 of Capital, the theory of money, credit, and interest-bearing capital, and he's writing on it all the time, collecting material and thinking about this. He was aware of the shortcomings of his theory of the ground rent and studying various types of and developments of modern capitalist agriculture to come to grips with that. He was aware of the enormous variety of forms of capitalism and capitalist development in different parts of the world. So actually he abandoned England as the model, the classical case for everything. It was still important for the factory system, but not for everything. His last word, I have already mentioned that in the beginning, so just I repeat it in order to print it into your minds. I will have to rewrite the whole thing. In 1881, with in a letter to Danielson. So, piece of pure speculation. Very nice game. What if I were Marx, or if you were Marx, and you had all this at your disposal? It's huge. The table would be full with all these notebooks. And then, of course, well, you have to imagine Marx's head full of what he has learned in many, many, many years. And he still had 10 years, imagine, 10, 15 years to continue his work. He still would be in good health. His wife would still be alive. I think that was the final blow, because Marx was a lucky man. He lived happily as long as his wife was alive. But when Jenny died, it was all over. It is a fact of life. It worked like that. So Capital would certainly, under these happy circumstances, which never existed, would have become a very different book, probably much longer, even much more complicated and more sophisticated. I think more mathematical and more historicizing at the same time. It would include a lot of pieces of what the French call histoire raisonnée, meaning, well, that you tell the logic of historical developments. It's already in there, built in Capital. And it would combine the analysis of the dynamics of modern industry with the analysis of the dynamics of modern capitalist credit, banking, and financial markets. The concepts are all already there, already not yet put to work. So the real heritage for Marxist political economists are a whole series of unsettled problems, plus a whole series of first thoughts and reflections of Marx, collections of material that are no longer up to date, but they show us in what way he, not a Hegelian philosopher, not anymore, by no means, was actually working, and the directions in which you could try, at least, to find good solutions. So I think it's still a project worth to be continued, but I'm very old-fashioned in this respect. Thank you very much for your
I wanted to thank Michael for the excellent presentation. It was very fascinating. It was a complete presentation in the incompleteness. And I think it's also very useful for the young scholars of Marx, especially in the English-speaking country, having this idea that Marx Capital is not only the 3 volumes that you find at the bookstores here, but now in the Mega, in a few weeks, there will be the last volume published. It's 15 volumes, thousands and thousands of pages.